All right, so we are on the last chapter of Thomas Pynchon's novel, The Crying of Lot 49. And now Oedipa Maas has returned back to Echo Courts to the motel. And she finds out that, and Metzger has left her a message. This was the man with whom she'd had an affair, cheated on her husband, Mucho Maas, with. And he has run off with a 15-year-old girl who is the girlfriend of one of the four Paranoids, the parody of the Beatles. So he's run off with this younger girl. So yet another man in Oedipa's life has left her. So keep that in mind as we go along here. Hilarious has gone crazy. And her husband, Mucho Maas, has gone crazy also under the influence of LSD. So she notices this pattern where she's mysteriously losing all the men in her life. Then she decides she's going to go see Emery Bortz, the professor who edited the original anthology that Richard Blatt, remember he was the director of the play, The Courier's Tragedy, put on at the Tank in San Francisco. She wants to go visit Bortz because he was the editor of the original hardcover edition. And she goes there and she finds all these grad students hanging around him. His wife is busy with the kids in the house. He's out on the back patio with grad students. And she goes back there and she's talking to him. And Bortz really represents the principle of fidelity to the text because he's a bit peeved by the fact that Richard Blatt was so free with the text and didn't really stick with it when he put on his performance of the Courier's Tragedy just to grasp the spirit of the thing with badly mimeographed versions of the script, coffee stained and difficult to read. And he tells her, so, what's left if there isn't, words? And she says, well, I want to know about the historical Warfinger. What was Richard Warfinger, the author of this play, really like? And then one of the grad students says, the historical Shakespeare, the historical Marx, the historical Jesus. He's right, shrugged Bortz. They're dead. What's left? She says, words. He says, pick some words that we can talk about. So then she quotes the couplet from the play, the only part of the play in which the Trastero is actually mentioned, which had read, the full version of it had been, he that we last as Turnantaxus knew, now recks no lord but the stiletto's thorn, and tacit, in other words, Turnantaxus, and tacit lies the gold once knotted horn. Recall the stamp, the official Turnantaxus stamp that has a once knotted horn at each corner. No hallowed skein of stars can ward, I trow, who's once been set his tryst with Trastero. It's the only time in the play that it's ever mentioned, but yet in other editions, those two lines are missing. And now Bortz, as she quotes those lines, Bortz blinked at her. And how he said, did you get into the Vatican Library? And then she says, or he says, well, there's a pornographic edition of the Courier's Tragedy that's available, for what reason I don't know, that's in the Vatican Library. And it's a pornographic version that contains that line. But now Richard Blatt, and then she finds out Blatt is dead now. And that there are so many students hanging around Bortz because they've been holding a wake for him. And she says, dead? Well, how did he die? And Bortz says, well, he just walked into the Pacific one night. Interesting, though, she has driven past Zapp's used bookstore on the way here, and it was burned to the ground. And when she went into the Army supply store or whatever that was next door to it, Winthrop Tremaine is the guy there, who has a Puritan name, notice, Winthrop, because he's selling Nazi armbands. So Pynchon is drawing an analogy between the Puritan down my store too. But meanwhile, I'm selling these Nazi armbands, so let me know if you want any. She's like, no thanks, you have fun with those armbands. On the way to Bortz's, she had this encounter. So note that the bookstore is burned down. Richard Blatt has committed suicide. She's beginning to suspect that this is the thorn that's in the lines there from the play of the Trastero. They're killing off, possibly murdering people whom they have crossed. But she doesn't know for sure. She just suspects this. And she also suspects that they may have played a role in the insanity of Hilarious and her husband. So in this conversation about the play, then Bortz is telling her, well, no, every time Richard Drablett put on the play every night, that couplet wasn't in there that mentioned the Tristero. He read from my edited version of the text, which omitted "No hallowed skein of stars can Mordai trow, who's once been set his tryst with Tristero." But oddly enough, only on the one night that Oedipa was there in the audience were those two lines there, referring to the Tristero. So Oedipus' paranoia is growing now. Why was it just on that one night? The position of a paranoid person. Why me? Why is this happening to me? Why is the world in a conspiracy to exclude me from it somehow, or persecute me? So this is actually starting to feel in her conversation here, and then he shows her some images on his slide projector from the pornographic version of the Courier's play, in which, for example, Pasquale, who Duke Angelo had wanted him to marry Francesca, Pasquale's mother. In this version of the play, they do marry, and there's a big sex scene, a big pornographic sex scene that's illustrated with woodcuts that Bortz shows her. And then he refers her to his collection of warfaringana. If I can barely pronounce it, Warfingeriana, where there's a book, and he says that, actually, before he says that, he says, the play was created by a group of Puritans called the Skirvamites. This pornographic version of the play that supposedly was in the Vatican was put together by these Puritans, oddly enough, the Skirvamites, who have this metaphysical bivalent opposition in their theological system of course, the elect versus the damned. And the elect are the ones whom God has chosen to save, and the damned are the praetorite, those who are passed over. But the Skirvamites, Bortz says, are the ones who have created this pornographic version of the play in order to sully the tradition of the theater and to show people how corrupt and degenerate the theater really is. Then she comes across a text called An Account of the Singular Peregrinations of Dr. Diocletian Blob Among the Italians, illuminated with exemplary tales from the true history of that outlandish and fantastical race, in which she discovers, he tells her to read chapter 7, but in chapter 8 she finds what she's looking for, where she gets a history of the Tristero a bit, and finds out that they originated in 1577, leading up to the 30 Years' War of the 17th century between Protestants and Catholics. And in 1577, William of Orange was in the Low Countries, and they were trying to establish their Protestant independence from the Catholic, of course, Holy Roman Empire, which at that time was disintegrating. And they had the Turnataxis postal monopoly as part of that empire, had a grand postmaster, whose name was Leonard I, Baron of Taxis, Grand Master of the Post for the Low Countries, and he then was replaced by a cousin named Jan Hinkert. And this Jan Hinkert then became the official postmaster of the Turnataxis monopoly. But then we meet, at this point, the founding figure of the Tristero enters the scene, one Hernando Joaquin de Tristero y Calavera. Calavera, of course, means skull. Tristero actually means sad. And he comes in claiming to be Jan Hinkert's cousin and having a right as an heir to the postal monopoly. So he launches a guerrilla war against the Turnataxis postal system and starts hijacking their routes and so forth. Jan Hinkert is dispossessed by Farnese, and then Leonard I is reinstated as the Grand Postmaster, and then so Tristero himself, which was originally a man, decides to found the Tristero, and he styles himself the Disinherited, and fashions a livery of black for his followers. They all wear black since they identify with the nighttime. This is the opposition between night and day. Everyone works 9 to 5 in the day, the privileged ones, the elite. Those who are on the fringes are the bohemian night owls, the ones who are on the fringes, who are the night ones. And then he creates an iconography with the post horn, which is now muted to oppose the single loop post horn of the Turnataxis organization. Post horn and a dead badger with its 4 feet in the air, because badger, taxi, or taxis, the name Taxis may have come from the Italian Tasso. Think of the great author Torquato Tasso that Goethe wrote a play about, who wrote the great epic Jerusalem Delivered. But Tasso means badger in Italian. and refers to hats of badger fur that the early Bergamascan couriers wore. So that's their official iconography, the muted post horn and the badger. We don't really see the badger much. And that's the foundations of the Trastero, and they've been harrying the official postal systems ever since, both the Turn and Toxis system and then later the American postal system. So Bortz is feeding her this narrative. She's getting all this information from this English professor, Emery Bortz, and he's feeding her this narrative. How much of this is true? And doubt begins to creep into her mind for the first time when she goes back to the bar, the Scope, to check with Mike Fallopian again, the guy who was a member of the Peter Pingwood Society, and we had already seen when she and Metzger went to this bar, him receiving a letter that did not have a stamp, and the only postmark was PPS. It didn't have the muted post horn. So he seemed to be part of a separate organization. So she's curious about this. She goes back to meet him, and she says, I'm surprised you people aren't using the system too, the Trastero system. And he says, are we an underground? Are we rejects? She goes, no, I didn't mean that. But then he says for the first time, has it ever occurred to you, Oedipa, that somebody's putting you on? That this is all a hoax, maybe something Invert he set up before he died? Actually, he was extremely wealthy, he had a lot of money. But this is quite a complex conspiracy for him to manufacture. But now she has doubts. She's not sure. And she's thinking, well, a conspiracy, of this nature, meaning what? That Bortz, along with Metzger, Cohen, Driblet, Kotex, the tattooed sailor in San Francisco, the waste carrier she'd seen, that all of them were Pierce Inverarity's men? Bots? Or loyal, for free, for fun, to some grandiose practical joke he'd cooked up, all for her embarrassment, or terrorizing, or moral improvement? She's also found out that Inverarity also owned the shopping mall where Zapp's used books had burned down in the store of Winthrop Tremaine, the swastika armband seller had been. He owned that, and he also owned the playhouse, the Tank, that the play was played at. So now she's wondering if Pierce Inverarity really put up a scheme here that was this elaborate to this extent, just to fuck with her, basically, somehow. But now she's feeling more and more alone and isolated. There was nobody who could help her, nobody in the world. They were all on something, her former men, mad, possible enemies, dead. She's losing everyone. All the men in her life are disappearing. And then she learns, she gets another piece of information, I believe, from Bortz. No, this one is the philatelist Genghis Cohen, who had showed her some of the fraudulent stamps in a previous chapter. And she learned that there was a schism in the Trastero during the French Revolution. There was a schism that eventually led to a bunch of them migrating to America, especially during the gold rush of 1849. And so this gives to the title another reference. Lot 49 also refers to the lot of the immigrants during the gold rush of 1849, among which there were quite a few Trastero members, apparently. And there had just been a postal reform, recall, in 1845, where the official U.S. Post Office had come down hard on all private carriers, squashing them out. But the Trastero then shows up as a counterforce. Pynchon always has this idea of a counterforce that mirrors or antagonizes the primary force. We'll see this again in Gravity's Rainbow. And they join up with Indians, or pretend to be Indians as they're hijacking Wells Fargo and the Pony Express and so forth. And then they look at some stamps a little more closely. Cohen's collection, it's actually Inverarity's collection of fraudulent Trastero stamps that have been made, that have been made by the Trastero. Now these are real stamps, except for the changes, the little fraudulent changes to them. You can look all of these stamps up on Google. Oedipa knew them by heart. In the 15-cent dark green from the 1893 Columbian Exposition issue, Columbus announcing his discovery, is the image on this stamp. You can pull it up. The faces of 3 courtiers receiving the news at the right-hand side of the stamp had been subtly altered to express uncontrollable fright. And if you look at that stamp, the courtiers on the side there are in adulation. They're not in fright. But the Trastero makes these slight alterations for their stamps as mirror images of the official stamps. They're mirroring the official arborescent monopoly with their rhizomatic horizontal or underground organization. In the 3-cent Mothers of America issue, put out on Mother's Day, 1934, the flowers to the lower left of Whistler's mother had been replaced by Venus's flytrap, belladonna, poison sumac, and a few others Oedipa had never seen. In the 1947 postage stamp centenary issue, commemorating the great postal reform that had meant the beginning of the end for private carriers, the head of a Pony Express rider at the lower left was set at a disturbing angle, unknown among the living. If you look at the actual stamp, the Pony Express rider is totally normal. His head's not at an odd angle. The deep violet 3-cent regular issue of 1954 had a faint, menacing smile on the face of the Statue of Liberty, and so on. So there's this collection that Cohn has that he's inherited from Inverarity of fraudulent stamps manufactured by the Trastero that now is going to be auctioned off as Lot 49 in a stamp bidding auction. And Cohen informs her that one of the clients, a guy named C. Morris Schrift, of course, Schrift in German means write. Morris suggests Morse code almost. C. Morris Schrift has a client whose name he will not mention, who is going to bid by mail. Cohen tells her, this is highly unusual. You have floor bidders who are there in person, but you also have book bidders who bid through mail, and this client will be bidding through mail, and it's highly unusual. Word has gotten around in the industry of this individual, whom now Oedipus suspects to be a member of the Trastero, who will bid on the lot and purchase it so as to prevent it from being held as evidence for the existence of the Trastero. And then the novel comes to its end with her in a state of total isolation, but bemoaning her fate, but then realizing that she's got this bivalent opposition, this binary opposition of either this or that. So she's trapped in this sort of either or thinking. Either the Trastero exists or it doesn't. It's got to be one or the other. So in other words, Pynchon ends up with the same kind of bivalent metaphysical opposition that Derrida loved to go after. And Derrida is writing Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, his famous essay, at about this time, which is the foundational text for deconstruction, where he goes after these kinds of oppositions and then he pulls them apart and says it's a false opposition, which ends up being kind of third term, the deconstruction of the opposition into a kind of entropic mess. This is what he has done, gone attacking the metaphysical oppositions that uphold the logocentrism of the West ever since Plato. This is Heidegger's metaphysical age, which becomes for Derrida, who began as a Husserl scholar, which becomes for Derrida the logocentric age, the age of privileging one term in any of these bivalent oppositions. The voice versus the text, man versus woman, culture versus nature. The ones on the left-hand side there are always privileged over the other ones. And so Derrida goes after that and pulls out the whole metaphysical edifice of the West so that we can no longer say that the signifiers refer to absolute grand transcendental signifieds that anchor them. Those signifieds are now gone. They've been deconstructed and dismantled. And so Oedipus is left with the postmodern inheritance of this metaphysical deconstructed tradition at the end of the novel. And then in the last couple of pages, she goes to the auction, and Cohen tells her, oh, the guy's going to be there after all. He's not going to bid through mail. So you'll find out this, if he is a Trastero guy who's here, you'll see him. And Oedipa she's not sure what she's going to do. She just wants to go to the auction. She's nervous. She meets Cohen there. They go into the auction room. They close the doors, lock them. There's all these men in mohair suits sitting there ready to begin as the bidder comes in. And Cohen explains that he will be crying Lot 49, which is the auctioneer talk for announcing how to bid on it. And then he stands up at the podium. This guy does, what's his name? Lauren Passerine, who's apparently famous in the industry as a crier. And he begins the crying of Lot 49. And Oedipus just sitting there waiting, and the last lines are, Passerine spread his arms in a gesture that seemed to belong to the priesthood of some remote culture, perhaps to a descending angel. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Oedipus settled back to await the crying of Lot 49. She's not sure what she's going to do. She thinks that she might make a scene and disrupt the proceedings. Oedipus has reached the end of her rope in this novel. She's pretty threadbare. She's strung out and on the verge of hysteria. This opposition, this bivalent opposition, is driving her to the brink of madness. And she may indeed end up like one of these men, one of her men that bad things have been happening to all along. Snadigan's situation that Pynchon is implying here. And so this becomes also a parody of the descent of the tongues of flame during Pentecost, the 50th day. After the 49, we get this 7 times 7 weeks, the 49, and the lot, which refers to the actual auctioneer's lot, but it also refers to the lot that Oedipa now finds herself in, as well as the lot of the Trastero and the 49ers who came over during the gold rush. So there are lots of meanings here embedded in this wonderful novel, one of the great postmodern masterpieces, Crying of Lot 49. Now we're going to move on to the monster, Gravity's Rainbow. We're going to tackle that thing and see what happens.